The gunshot rang out across the empty plain as Yates Parker stood there, rifle in hand, watching the rustler who'd tried to steal his cattle fall dead in the dirt. The year was 1878, and in Belmont, Nevada, justice still came from the barrel of a gun. Yates hadn't wanted to kill the man, but when he'd found him trying to lead away 3 of his prized cattle in the dead of night, there hadn't been much choice. The thief had drawn first. Yates lowered his smoking rifle and sighed deeply. At 32 years old, he'd seen enough death to last a lifetime. The war between the states had taken his youth, his mining ventures had taken his fortune, and childbirth had taken his beloved wife, Caroline. All he had left was his small ranch and his 4-year-old son, Timothy. Pa. The small voice came from behind him. Yates turned to see Timothy standing on the porch of their modest ranch house, rubbing his eyes sleepily, his small frame silhouetted by the oil lamp burning inside. "Go back to bed, son," Yates called, his voice gentler than he thought possible after what he'd just done. "Everything's all right now, but everything wasn't all right." It hadn't been for 2 years, not since Caroline died, bringing Timothy's little sister into the world, a baby girl who hadn't survived either. Yates had been trying to raise his son alone ever since, but the ranch was struggling, and he was struggling even more with being both mother and father to a child who needed more than he could give. As the sun rose over the Nevada desert the next morning, Yates saddled his horse. He'd buried the rustler at dawn in an unmarked grave at the edge of his property. Now he needed to ride into town to report the incident to Sheriff Miller, though in these parts, defending your property rarely required much explanation. "Can I come, Pa?" Timothy asked, looking up with those eyes that were so much like his mother's. The boy had Caroline's golden hair too, unlike Yates' dark brown. "Not today, son. Mrs. Winters is coming to look after you while I'm gone." Ella Winters was their nearest neighbor, a widow who lived a mile down the road. She'd been kind enough to help with Timothy when needed, but she was getting on in years, and Yates couldn't keep imposing on her charity. Timothy's face fell, but he didn't argue. He'd grown used to disappointment. Yates tousled the boy's hair. "I'll bring you back some candy from the general store." That earned him a small smile, at least. The ride into Belmont took nearly an hour. The town had sprung up during the silver boom of the 1860s, and though the mines weren't producing like they once had, Belmont remained the county seat and a respectable settlement with several businesses lining its main street. Yates tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside. Sheriff Miller was at his desk, a cup of coffee in hand. "Morning, Parker. What brings you in?" "Had some trouble last night. Caught a rustler trying to make off with 3 of my cattle. He drew on me." Yates didn't need to explain what happened next. Miller nodded. "Know who he was?" "Never seen him before. Skinny fellow, dark hair, scar across his left cheek." The sheriff sighed. "Sounds like Hank Doyle. Been causing trouble up and down the territory. You did the county a favor." Yates didn't feel like he'd done anyone a favor. "One more grave on his land, one more death on his conscience. I'll be going then." "Wait a minute, Parker," Miller called as Yates turned to leave. "Stage is coming in today. Heard there's a woman on it looking for work as a schoolteacher or governess. Might be worth talking to her for the boy's sake." Yates paused. Timothy would be starting school soon, but the nearest schoolhouse was in town, too far for daily travel. He'd been putting off thinking about it, but he couldn't delay much longer. "When's the stage due?" he asked. "Should be here by noon." Yates nodded his thanks and headed to the general store to pass the time. He picked up supplies they needed: flour, coffee, sugar, and a stick of peppermint candy for Timothy. As he paid, he couldn't help overhearing the storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Henderson, chatting with another woman. "Poor thing," she was saying. "Traveled all the way from Boston after her father passed, said she couldn't bear to stay there with all the memories, wanted a fresh start out west." "Do you think she knows what she's getting into?" the other woman asked. "A refined Eastern lady in a place like Belmont," Mrs. Henderson shrugged. "She seemed determined, said she's been teaching children for years." Yates gathered his purchases and stepped outside. The stage was just pulling into town, 4 dusty horses drawing the weathered coach to a stop outside the hotel. The driver jumped down to open the door, and a woman emerged. She wasn't what Yates expected. Young mid-20s at most, with auburn hair peeking out from beneath a modest bonnet. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue that had once been fine, but now showed signs of the long journey. As she turned to thank the driver, Yates saw her face clearly for the first time. She was beautiful, with delicate features and intelligent eyes, but there was something else there, a hint of sadness, perhaps, or determination. The woman collected her trunk and a smaller valise, insisting she could manage on her own, and made her way toward the hotel. Yates found himself watching her longer than was proper. It had been 2 years since Caroline died, and he hadn't looked at another woman since. He hadn't wanted to. But something about this newcomer stirred a feeling he'd thought long buried. Shaking himself out of his reverie, Yates mounted his horse and headed back to the ranch. He had responsibilities, a son to raise, a ranch to run. He couldn't be distracted by a pretty face, no matter how intriguing. When he arrived home, Mrs. Winters was sitting on the porch with Timothy, teaching him to whittle a piece of soft pine. The boy jumped up when he saw his father. "Did you bring the candy, Pa?" Yates smiled and handed him the peppermint stick. "I did. What do you say to Mrs. Winters for looking after you?" "Thank you, madam," Timothy said dutifully before returning his attention to the precious candy. Mrs. Winters rose stiffly. "He's a good boy, Yates, but he needs more than an old woman and a busy father can give him." "I know." Yates helped her down the steps. "Sheriff mentioned there's a new woman in town looking for work as a teacher. Might be worth talking to her." "Do that," Mrs. Winters said firmly. "That boy needs a woman's influence." After she left, Yates spent the afternoon mending fences with Timothy, helping as best a 4-year-old could. The boy chattered about the animals he'd seen that morning, the cloud shapes, and 100 other observations that only children find worthy of comment. Yates listened with half an ear, his mind still on the woman from the stagecoach. That evening, after Timothy was in bed, Yates sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars emerge in the vast Nevada sky. The ranch wasn't much, a small house, a barn, a corral, and about 50 head of cattle, but it was theirs, his and Timothy's. Caroline had loved it here, had seen the beauty in the harsh landscape that most missed. She'd planted wildflowers along the path to the house, insisting that beauty was necessary for the soul. The flowers still bloomed each spring, though Yates couldn't bring himself to tend them the way she had. Some things were too painful to continue. The next morning, Yates made a decision. He and Timothy would ride into town to meet this new teacher. If she was willing to come out to the ranch a few times a week to teach Timothy, it would solve one of his most pressing problems. They set out after breakfast, Timothy riding in front of Yates on the saddle, his small hands gripping the horn with the serious concentration of a child entrusted with an important task. The boy rarely got to go to town, and his excitement was palpable. Belmont was busier than usual when they arrived. Saturday was market day, and farmers and ranchers from miles around had brought their goods to sell. Yates lifted Timothy down from the horse and took his hand firmly. "Stay close, son. It's crowded today." They made their way to the hotel, where Yates inquired about the new arrival. "Miss Daniela Owens," the clerk confirmed. "Yes, she's staying with us. Took breakfast in the dining room about half an hour ago. Might still be there." Yates thanked him and led Timothy toward the small dining room at the back of the hotel. As they entered, he immediately spotted the woman from yesterday sitting alone at a corner table, a cup of tea and a book in front of her. She looked up as they approached, and Yates felt an unexpected nervousness. "Miss Owens?" he asked, removing his hat. "I'm Yates Parker. This is my son, Timothy. I understand you're looking for a position as a teacher." Daniela Owens smiled, and something in Yates' chest tightened. Up close, her eyes were green with flecks of gold, intelligent and warm. "Mr. Parker, yes, I am." Her voice had the refined accent of the East, but it wasn't pretentious. She turned her attention to Timothy. "Hello, Timothy. It's very nice to meet you." Timothy, usually shy with strangers, smiled back at her. "Hello, madam. Please sit down," she offered, gesturing to the empty chairs at her table. Yates helped Timothy into a chair and then took one himself, setting his hat on the table. "I have a small ranch about an hour from town. My son needs schooling, but the distance makes it difficult to bring him to town daily. I was wondering if you might be interested in coming to the ranch a few times a week to teach him. Daniela considered this. I was hoping for a position teaching multiple children, perhaps in a schoolhouse. Belmont has a small school, but they already have a teacher, Yates explained. Most of the surrounding ranches and farms are too spread out for a central school beyond town. She nodded thoughtfully. What sort of arrangement did you have in mind? Room and board at the ranch, plus a fair wage. You'd have your own space, of course. Yates hadn't actually thought this through before speaking, but the idea formed as he talked. There's a small cabin near the main house that was built for the ranch hand I used to employ. It could be made comfortable for you. Daniela looked at Timothy, who was watching her with undisguised curiosity. And you're how old, Timothy? 4, the boy answered proudly, holding up the correct number of fingers. Almost 5, Yates added. His birthday's next month, a good age to begin formal learning, Daniela mused. She turned back to Yates. I should tell you, Mr. Parker, that I came west for a new beginning. My father recently passed, and Boston held too many painful memories. I'm not running from scandal or trouble, if that concerns you. It doesn't, Yates said simply. We all have our reasons for being where we are. She seemed to appreciate his lack of prying. I'd like to see your ranch before making a decision, if that's acceptable. Of course, we can arrange that at your convenience. They agreed that Yates would return with the wagon the following day to take her to the ranch. As he and Timothy left the hotel, the boy looked up at him. I like her, Pa. She has nice eyes. Yates smiled despite himself. Yes, son, I suppose she does. The next morning, Yates rose earlier than usual. He spent an hour cleaning the cabin that would be Daniela's if she accepted his offer. It was a simple structure, one room with a small stove, a bed, a table, and 2 chairs, but it was sound and could be made comfortable. He changed the bedding, swept the floor, and made sure the stove was in working order. Timothy followed him around, asking endless questions. Will she live here forever? Does she like horses? Can she make apple pies like Mama used to? The last question made Yates pause. Timothy rarely mentioned his mother anymore, and sometimes Yates worried the boy was forgetting her. He had been only 2 when Caroline died. I don't know what kind of pies she makes, son, but she's not coming to be your mama. She's coming to be your teacher if she decides to accept the position. Timothy nodded solemnly, but Yates could see the wheels turning in his young mind. They set out for town after an early lunch. Yates had cleaned up the wagon, which they rarely used, preferring horseback for most journeys. He'd even placed a cushion on the hard bench seat, an old one from the parlor that Caroline had embroidered years ago. When they reached the hotel, Daniela was waiting in the lobby with her trunk and valise. She wore a simpler dress today, more practical for ranch life, though still finer than anything the local women typically wore. Her hair was tied back neatly, revealing more of her face, which was even lovelier than Yates had remembered. Miss Owens, he greeted her, again removing his hat. Ready to see the ranch? Yes, thank you, Mr. Parker. She smiled at Timothy. Hello again, Timothy. I'm looking forward to our adventure today. Timothy beamed at her. Yates helped load her trunk onto the wagon, then assisted her onto the bench seat. Timothy insisted on sitting between them, which was probably for the best. Yates was acutely aware of Miss Owens' presence beside him, the light scent of lavender that seemed to surround her, so different from the practical soap and sun-dried cotton smells of the ranch women he knew. As they drove out of town, Daniela asked questions about the area, the climate, the plants and animals, the history of settlement. Yates answered as best he could, surprising himself with how much he actually knew. Caroline had been the one who loved learning and books. He'd always been more practical, focused on the work at hand. But he found himself wanting to impress this educated Eastern woman, to show her that ranchers weren't all ignorant frontiersmen. It's beautiful in its way, Daniela commented as they drove across the high desert, the mountains visible in the distance. Different from New England, certainly, but it has its own majesty. My wife used to say the same thing, Yates replied before he could stop himself. He rarely mentioned Caroline to strangers. Your wife had good taste, Daniela said gently. Is she? She passed during childbirth 2 years ago, Yates said, keeping his voice even for Timothy's sake, along with our daughter. I'm very sorry, Daniela said, and the genuine compassion in her voice made something in Yates' chest ache. It must have been difficult for both of you. Timothy looked up at her. I don't remember Mama much. Pa has a picture he shows me sometimes. That's a wonderful way to keep her memory alive, Daniela told him. They arrived at the ranch in the late afternoon. Yates was suddenly self-conscious about the modest homestead. It wasn't much compared to what a Boston lady would be accustomed to, but it was clean and well-maintained. This is it, he said as they pulled up to the house. The cabin I mentioned is just over there. He pointed to the small structure about 50 yards from the main house, partially sheltered by a stand of cottonwood trees. Daniela took in the scene: the house, the barn, the corrals with a few horses, the open range beyond where cattle grazed. It's lovely, she said, and Yates could tell she meant it. He showed her the cabin first, watching anxiously as she inspected the simple quarters. It needs some work, he admitted, but I can make any changes you require. It's quite adequate, she assured him. Cozy even, a fresh coat of whitewash inside would brighten it considerably. I can do that tomorrow, Yates offered. Next, they toured the main house. It was larger than the cabin, but still modest by Eastern standards: a parlor, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a small study that had been Caroline's domain, where she'd kept her books and written letters to her family back east. Yates rarely entered it now. This would be where we'd have lessons, he explained, gesturing to the parlor. There's plenty of light, and the table can be used for writing practice. Daniela nodded approvingly. It's a fine space for learning, and what subjects do you wish Timothy to study? Reading, writing, arithmetic to start, history, geography as he gets older, whatever you think appropriate. Yates hesitated. I want him to be educated, Miss Owens. I don't want him limited to this life if he chooses something different when he's grown. She looked at him with new respect. That's a progressive attitude, Mr. Parker. Many men would expect their sons to follow in their footsteps without question. I learned long ago that forcing someone into a life they don't want leads to unhappiness for all concerned. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. After the tour, Yates prepared a simple dinner while Timothy enthusiastically showed Daniela his treasures: a collection of interesting rocks, a wooden horse his father had carved for him, and a tattered picture book that had been read so many times the pages were falling apart. Over the meal of fried chicken, potatoes, and greens from the small garden Yates maintained, Daniela shared more about herself. She was 26, had taught at private girls' school in Boston for 5 years, and had come west after her father's death left her alone in the world. I could have stayed in Boston, continued teaching at the school, but every corner of the city held memories, she explained. I wanted to see more of the country, to be somewhere completely different. When I saw the advertisement seeking teachers for Western territories, it seemed like fate. It's not an easy life out here, Yates warned, especially for a woman alone. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Parker, she replied with a slight smile, and I'm not afraid of hard work or solitude. After dinner, as the sun was setting, Daniela announced her decision. I'd like to accept your offer, Mr. Parker. I believe Timothy and I will get along splendidly, and I'm eager for a new challenge. Relief washed over Yates. He hadn't realized how much he'd been hoping she would stay. That's excellent news, Miss Owens. When would you like to begin? I'll need to return to town to collect the rest of my belongings and settle my bill at the hotel. Perhaps the day after tomorrow. They agreed on the arrangements, including her salary and duties. She would teach Timothy 5 mornings a week and would have her afternoons and weekends free. In addition to teaching, she would help with some light household tasks, though Yates insisted he and Timothy would continue to handle most of the cooking and cleaning themselves, as they had been doing. As they prepared to take her back to town for the night, Timothy looked crestfallen. Can't Miss Owens stay now, Pa? I want to show her my secret fishing spot tomorrow. Miss Owens needs to prepare for her move, son, Yates explained, and we need to get her cabin ready. Remember, I promised to whitewash the walls. Daniela knelt to Timothy's level. I'll be back before you know it, Timothy. And then you can show me all your special places. We'll have plenty of time. This seemed to satisfy the boy, and they made the return journey to Belmont as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Yates found himself glancing at Daniella's profile, illuminated by the fading light. There was something about her, a quiet strength, an intelligence, a kindness that drew him to her. It had been so long since he'd felt this kind of interest in another person that he hardly recognized the feeling. Back in town, he helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk back into the hotel. "I'll return for you the day after tomorrow, as we agreed." "Thank you, Mr. Parker. I'm looking forward to it." She hesitated, then added, "Your son is a delightful child. You've done well with him, despite the difficulties you've faced." Yates felt a surge of pride. "Thank you. He's everything to me." As he drove back to the ranch with a sleepy Timothy nestled against him, Yates found himself thinking about the changes that were coming to their quiet life. Having a woman around again, especially one as refined and educated as Daniella Owens, would be an adjustment, but for Timothy's sake, it was necessary. And if Yates himself found her company more agreeable than he'd expected, well, that was neither here nor there. The next day was a flurry of activity. True to his word, Yates whitewashed the cabin walls, repaired a loose floorboard, and added a small bookshelf he'd made from scrap lumber. Timothy helped by holding nails and offering constant commentary. They aired out the bedding in the sun, swept the yard, and even picked wildflowers to place in a jar on the table. "Are you sweet on Miss Owens, Pa?" Timothy asked innocently as they worked. Yates nearly dropped the hammer he was holding. "What? No, son. Miss Owens is going to be your teacher." "That's all?" Timothy looked unconvinced but dropped the subject, turning instead to the important question of whether Miss Owens might like the wooden toy horse he'd decided to give her as a welcoming gift. By the time they went to bed that night, the cabin was as ready as they could make it. Yates lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was making a mistake bringing a stranger into their lives. But Timothy needed education, and Yates needed help. Miss Owens seemed perfectly suited to provide both. The fact that she was beautiful and intriguing was irrelevant. The following day, Yates drove into town alone to collect Daniella, leaving Timothy with Mrs. Winters once more. The boy had protested, but Yates didn't want to make the round trip twice in one day, and he needed to help Daniella settle her affairs in town. When he arrived at the hotel, Daniella was waiting with her remaining belongings, another trunk, several boxes of books, and a small cage containing a canary. "I hope the bird won't be a problem," she said when she saw his surprised expression. "Sonny is my one luxury. He's been with me since Boston." "No problem at all," Yates assured her, helping to load her possessions onto the wagon. "Timothy will be delighted. He loves animals of all kinds." They made several stops in town, at the general store for supplies Daniella needed, at the post office where she arranged to have any mail forwarded to the ranch, and at the bank where she deposited most of her savings, keeping only a small amount for immediate needs. As they were leaving the bank, Sheriff Miller approached them. "Parker, Miss Owens, heard you're taking up residence at the Parker Ranch. News travels fast," Yates commented dryly. "Small town," Miller replied with a shrug. "Just wanted to let you know there's been reports of the Doyle gang operating in the area." Yates tensed. "I thought Hank Doyle was working alone when I caught him. He's got two brothers just as mean as he was. They might be looking to settle scores now that Hank's dead." The sheriff looked at Daniella. "Just be careful out there, miss. Keep your doors locked at night." "Thank you for the warning, Sheriff," Daniella said calmly. Though Yates noticed she'd gone slightly pale as they drove out of town, Yates felt the need to reassure her. "The ranch is safe, Miss Owens. I keep a rifle and I'm a light sleeper. No harm will come to you there." She gave him a small smile. "I'm not easily frightened, Mr. Parker. My father was a professor who specialized in the American frontier. He raised me on tales of pioneer women who faced far worse dangers than a few outlaws." Yates found himself impressed once again by her fortitude. "Still, I'd feel better if you'd let me teach you to shoot. Every person on a ranch should know how to handle a firearm." "I would appreciate that," she agreed. "Though I should warn you, my father did teach me the basics. He believed in practical education alongside academic studies." "A wise man," Yates commented. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The landscape stretched around them, vast and unchanging, the mountains in the distance a permanent anchor in a world that seemed to shift beneath Yates' feet more with each passing day. When they arrived at the ranch, Timothy came running out to meet them, Mrs. Winters following more slowly behind. The boy was beside himself with excitement, hopping from one foot to the other as Yates helped Daniela down from the wagon. "You came back," Timothy exclaimed. "Pa fixed your house and I picked extra flowers and I have a present for you." Daniela laughed, a warm, genuine sound that made something in Yates' chest loosen. "I'm very happy to be here, Timothy, and I can't wait to see my present," Mrs. Winters approached, eyeing Daniela with undisguised curiosity. Yates made the introductions, and the older woman seemed satisfied with what she saw. "It's about time this place had a woman's touch again," she said bluntly. "These two need looking after, though they'd never admit it. Mrs. Winters, Miss Owens is here as Timothy's teacher, not our housekeeper," Yates corrected, feeling his ears grow warm. "Of course," Mrs. Winters agreed with a knowing look that made Yates even more uncomfortable. "Well, I'll leave you to get settled. Timothy was a perfect gentleman today, as always." After the older woman departed, Yates and Timothy helped Daniela move her belongings into the cabin. The canary's cage was hung in the window where the morning sun would warm it. The books were arranged on the new shelf, and Timothy presented his gift, the wooden horse he treasured, carefully wrapped in a scrap of cloth. "It's beautiful," Daniela exclaimed, turning the toy over in her hands. "Did you make this, Timothy?" "Pa made it for my birthday, but I want you to have it so you won't be lonely in your new house." Daniela knelt to hug the boy. "That's the kindest gift anyone has given me in a very long time, thank you. I'll keep it right beside my bed so I can see it first thing every morning." Timothy beamed with pride. Yates felt a strange mixture of emotions watching them together: gratitude that his son had taken so quickly to Daniela, concern about the bond forming so rapidly, and something else he couldn't quite name, something warm and tender and frightening all at once. That evening, Daniela joined them for dinner in the main house. She had changed into a simple dress of pale yellow that brightened the room like a ray of sunshine. Timothy chattered throughout the meal, barely pausing for breath, telling her about the ranch, the animals, his favorite games, and asking dozens of questions about her life in Boston. "Did you have a horse there? Have you ever seen an ocean? Do you know how to make a fishing pole? Can we start learning tomorrow? Pa says I'm smart." "Timothy," Yates finally interrupted, "let Miss Owens eat her dinner in peace. There will be plenty of time for questions later." "It's quite all right," Daniela assured him. "I enjoy his curiosity." "And yes, Timothy, we can begin our lessons tomorrow morning after breakfast." After Timothy was tucked into bed, Yates and Daniela sat on the porch as the day's heat dissipated into the cool night air. The stars were emerging, brilliant against the darkening sky. Crickets chirped in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. "It's peaceful here," Daniela said softly. "Different from what I'm used to, but peaceful." "Most days," Yates agreed, "though ranching has its share of excitement too." Calving season round up the occasional rustler. He trailed off, remembering the man he'd killed just days ago. "Sheriff Miller mentioned the Doyle brothers," Daniela said, seemingly reading his thoughts. "Are they likely to cause trouble?" Yates sighed. "Hard to say. Outlaws like that are unpredictable, but the ranch is remote, and we don't have much worth stealing apart from the cattle, which are too much trouble to rustle in small numbers." Daniela nodded, accepting his assessment. "Tell me about Timothy's mother, if you don't mind. It would help me understand him better." Yates was silent for a long moment, collecting his thoughts. He rarely spoke about Caroline, even to those who had known her, but something about the quiet night and Daniela's gentle question made it easier. Caroline was from Philadelphia originally. Came west with her family during the Silver Rush. She was educated, like you loved books and learning. We met when I was working a claim that didn't pan out. Her father owned the assay office in town. He smiled at the memory. She was the one who convinced me to try ranching instead. Said I was too stubborn to quit the frontier but too intelligent to waste my life chasing silver that might not be there. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Too good for me, that's certain, but she loved it here, made this place a home. Yates gestured toward the wildflowers that lined the path, now silvery in the moonlight. Planted those herself, insisted on having beauty around us. And she died in childbirth, Daniela said softly, not a question but an acknowledgement of the pain he carried. Yes, there were complications. The doctor was 3 days' ride away, and by the time he arrived, it was too late for both of them. Yates' voice was flat, emotionless, the only way he could tell the story without breaking. Timothy was just 2. Young enough that he doesn't really remember her, which is both a blessing and a tragedy. You've done well with him, Daniela said. He's a wonderful child, bright, curious, kind. She would be proud. Yates nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer before Daniela stood. I should retire. Tomorrow will be a busy day. She hesitated, then added, Thank you for sharing about Caroline. I know it couldn't have been easy. Strangely, it was easier than I expected, Yates admitted. Good night, Miss Owens. Good night, Mr. Parker. Watching her walk to her cabin, the lamplight guiding her way, Yates felt something shift inside him, like a door long closed beginning to creak open. He wasn't ready to examine what that meant, but for the first time in 2 years, he felt something other than grief and responsibility. Something like hope. The following weeks established a new rhythm at the Parker Ranch. Each morning after breakfast, Timothy would have his lessons with Daniela in the parlor of the main house. Yates would work the ranch mending fences, tending cattle, repairing equipment, but he found himself inventing reasons to return to the house during lesson time, just to catch glimpses of his son and Daniela together. She was a natural teacher, firm but kind, challenging Timothy while making learning a joy rather than a chore. The boy flourished under her attention, soaking up knowledge like the desert soil absorbs rare rain. In the afternoons, when lessons were done, Timothy often spent time with Daniela in her cabin or following her around as she explored the ranch, identifying plants and birds, asking endless questions that she answered with remarkable patience. Yates worried sometimes that the boy was becoming too attached, but he couldn't bring himself to discourage the relationship. Timothy needed a woman's influence, and Daniela genuinely seemed to enjoy his company. As for Yates himself, he found his initial attraction to Daniela growing into something deeper and more complicated. She was unlike any woman he'd known, educated but practical, refined but willing to adapt to ranch life, independent but warm. He caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking, noting the way sunlight turned her auburn hair to flame, the graceful movements of her hands as she worked, the sound of her laughter when Timothy said something amusing. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Yates returned from checking the herd to find Daniela and Timothy sitting on a blanket under the cottonwood trees, a book open between them. As he approached, he realized she was teaching his son to read from a collection of poetry. I wandered lonely as a cloud, Timothy recited carefully, his small finger tracing the words, that floats on high ore vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Excellent, Timothy, Daniela praised. You're making remarkable progress. Yates stopped, not wanting to interrupt the moment. There was something about the scene, the two of them together in the golden late afternoon light, heads bent over the book, Timothy's face alight with concentration and pride that made his chest ache with a complex mixture of emotions. Timothy looked up and spotted him. Pa, I'm reading poetry. Miss Owens says it's by a man named Wordsworth who loved nature just like we do. Yates approached, smiling at his son's enthusiasm. That's wonderful, son. I'm impressed. Most children Timothy's age are just learning their letters, Daniela explained, looking up at Yates with those remarkable green-gold eyes. He has a natural aptitude for language. Like his mother, Yates said softly. She could quote Shakespeare by heart. Something passed between them then, a moment of shared understanding that felt intimate despite the simplicity of the exchange. Daniela held his gaze a moment longer than necessary before turning back to Timothy. Shall we continue? There's just a little more before dinner. That night after Timothy was asleep, Yates found himself knocking on Daniella's cabin door. She answered quickly, still dressed though her hair was unpinned, falling in waves around her shoulders. The sight momentarily robbed him of speech. "Mr. Parker, is something wrong?" He collected himself. "No, nothing's wrong. I wanted to thank you for what you're doing with Timothy, not just the regular lessons, but the extra time you spend with him, the poetry, everything," she smiled, stepping back to invite him in. "It's no hardship. He's a remarkable child." Yates entered the cabin, suddenly aware that this was the first time he'd been inside since she moved in. She had transformed the simple space, adding touches that made it distinctly hers, books everywhere. Not just on the shelf he'd built, but stacked on the table and beside the bed, wildflowers in jars on the windowsill, a colorful quilt on the bed that she must have brought from Boston. The canary dozed in its cage, a small puff of yellow feathers. "Would you like some tea?" she offered. "I just made a pot." "Thank you." She poured 2 cups and they sat at the small table. Yates was acutely conscious of the impropriety of the situation, a man alone with an unmarried woman in her quarters after dark, but the ranch was isolated, and they were both adults. Still, he wouldn't stay long. "I've been meaning to ask," he said. "Are you happy here?" "I know it's very different from what you're accustomed to." Daniella considered the question. "I am, surprisingly so. I came west seeking a change, but I didn't expect to find such peace. There's a simplicity to life here that I find refreshing after Boston's complexities." "And you don't mind the isolation, the lack of society," she smiled. "I was never much for society, Mr. Parker. I preferred books to balls even in Boston. Here I have my books, meaningful work, and good company. What more could I ask?" Yates found himself returning her smile. "I'm glad to hear it. We're certainly pleased to have you, especially Timothy." He hesitated, then added, "He's becoming quite attached to you." A shadow crossed her face. "I hope that doesn't concern you. I'm careful not to overstep my role as his teacher." "No, it doesn't concern me. He needs." Yates paused, searching for the right words. "He needs what you provide: gentleness, patience, learning, things I try to give him but can't always manage alongside everything else." "You're too hard on yourself," Daniella said quietly. "You're a wonderful father. Timothy adores you." "I do my best," Yates said simply, "but there are gaps only a woman can fill." The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Yates drained his tea and stood. "I should go. Thank you for the tea and again for everything you're doing for Timothy." At the door he turned back. "Good night, Miss Owens." "Daniella," she said suddenly. "Please, when it's just us, I'd prefer Daniella." Yates nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "Daniella then, and I'm Yates. Good night, Yates." He walked back to the main house under a canopy of stars, feeling as if something significant had just occurred, though he couldn't have explained exactly what it was. Summer gave way to fall, bringing cooler temperatures and changing colors to the landscape around the ranch. Timothy continued to thrive under Daniella's tutelage, and Yates found himself increasingly drawn to her company in the evenings after his son was asleep. They would sit on the porch of the main house or in her cabin, talking about books, the East versus the West, philosophy, politics, anything and everything. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. Yates couldn't remember the last time he'd had such stimulating conversations. Caroline had been intelligent and well-read, but their discussions had always centered around practical matters: the ranch, their future plans, Timothy. With Daniella, he found himself exploring ideas he hadn't considered in years, seeing the world through fresh eyes. One crisp October evening, they were discussing a novel she had lent him, Wuthering Heights, a story he had found both disturbing and compelling. "I don't understand Heathcliff," he admitted. "To destroy so many lives out of bitterness and revenge, what purpose does it serve?" "Some would say he's not meant to be understood, but experienced," Daniella replied, her face animated in the lamplight. "He's a force of nature like the Moors themselves, a destructive force." "Yes, but aren't many natural forces destructive? Floods, fires, storms, they destroy, but they also clear the way for new growth, new beginnings." Yates considered this. I prefer characters who build rather than destroy. Who leave the world better than they found it. Daniela smiled. A very Western perspective, the frontier spirit of creation and progress. Perhaps, he conceded. Though I've seen my share of destruction here too. They fell silent, each lost in thought. The night was growing cold and Daniela shivered slightly. Without thinking, Yates removed his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly, pulling it closer around her. Their eyes met and something passed between them, a current of attraction neither could deny any longer. Yates leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But she didn't. Their lips met in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened, years of loneliness and longing pouring into the contact. Her hands came up to his shoulders and his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Yates rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, heart pounding. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I've wanted you to," she whispered back. He drew back slightly to look at her, needing to see her face. "Daniela, I don't know what this is between us, but I know it's something I haven't felt in a very long time, maybe ever." "I feel it too," she said simply. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, marveling at the softness of her skin. "We should be careful, for Timothy's sake. He's already so attached to you, and if we don't." "I understand," she assured him, though he could see a hint of sadness in her eyes. "We should take things slowly, see where they lead." Yates nodded, though part of him wanted to throw caution to the wind, to pull her into his arms again and never let go. But she was right. They needed to be sure, for all their sakes. He walked her back to her cabin, stealing one more kiss before saying goodnight. As he returned to the main house, Yates felt lighter than he had in years, as if a weight he'd been carrying had suddenly lifted. But there was also fear of opening himself to loss again, fear of disrupting the delicate balance he and Timothy had established, fear that this newfound happiness might somehow be snatched away. Over the following weeks, Yates and Daniela's relationship deepened, though they were careful to keep their growing feelings private when Timothy was present. Their evenings together became precious time, hours spent in conversation, occasional touches, lingering kisses that left both wanting more. Timothy seemed oblivious to the change, content with the attention he received from both adults. He continued to flourish under Daniela's teaching, his natural intelligence sharpened by her methods. By November, he was reading simple books on his own, adding small numbers, and developing an impressive vocabulary for a child not yet 5. As Thanksgiving approached, the first snow dusted the mountains in the distance. Yates began preparations for winter, stockpiling firewood, ensuring the cattle had shelter from the coming storms, repairing the roofs on both houses. Daniela helped where she could, quickly adapting to the seasonal rhythms of ranch life. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the main house after Timothy was asleep, Yates found himself studying Daniela's profile, committing to memory the curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw, the way the firelight caught in her hair. "What are you thinking?" she asked, catching his gaze. "That I can't imagine this place without you anymore," he answered honestly. She smiled, reaching for his hand. "I can't imagine being anywhere else." Yates took a deep breath. "I've been wanting to ask you something." He hesitated, gathering his courage. "Would you consider staying permanently? Not just as Timothy's teacher, but as my wife." Daniela's eyes widened. "Are you proposing, Yates Parker?" "Not very romantically, I'm afraid," he admitted with a rueful smile. "But yes, I am. I love you, Daniela. I think I've loved you since that first day on the porch when we talked about Caroline and the stars. You've brought light back into our lives, and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." Tears glistened in her eyes. "I love you too, and yes, I'll marry you." Yates pulled her into his arms, his heart so full he thought it might burst. They held each other for a long time, the fire crackling beside them, snow beginning to fall outside, the promise of a future together warming them more than any flame could. "When should we tell Timothy?" Daniela asked eventually. "Tomorrow," Yates decided. "At breakfast, it'll be an early Christmas present for him." Timothy's reaction the next morning exceeded even their expectations. When Yates explained that he had asked Daniela to marry him and become part of their family, the boy launched himself at her with such force he nearly knocked her chair over. "Does this mean you'll be my new mama?" he asked, his small face alight with hope. Daniela glanced at Yates, uncertain how to respond. They hadn't discussed this specific aspect of their new relationship. "If that's what you want to call her," Yates said carefully. "But remember, you had a mama who loved you very much. Daniela isn't replacing her." "I know," Timothy said with the simple acceptance of childhood. "But I think Mama would want me to have a new one now that she's in heaven, and I want Miss Daniela to be my mama." Daniela hugged him close, tears in her eyes. "I would be honored to be your mama, Timothy. But you can call me whatever feels right to you. When will you get married?" he asked, practical as always. "We haven't decided yet," Yates told him, "but soon." They agreed on a Christmas wedding to be held in Belmont with the few friends they had in the area as witnesses. It would be small and simple, befitting their circumstances and preferences. Daniela would wear her best dress, the blue one she had worn when she first arrived, and Yates would wear his Sunday suit, rarely used but kept carefully in a trunk for special occasions. The weeks leading up to the wedding were busy with preparations for both the ceremony and the winter ahead. Daniela sewed new curtains for the main house, where she would move after the wedding. Timothy helped her transplant some of her wildflowers from around her cabin to the path leading to what would soon be their shared home. Yates built a larger bookshelf for the parlor to accommodate her extensive collection. They also prepared for Christmas, wanting to make it special for Timothy. Yates rode into town for supplies, returning with small gifts for both his son and his bride-to-be, hidden carefully until the day arrived. 3 days before Christmas, a storm blew in from the mountains, more severe than any they had experienced that season. Snow fell heavily, driven by fierce winds that howled around the buildings and through the trees. Yates insisted that Daniela stay in the main house rather than return to her cabin, giving her his bedroom while he slept on a pallet by the fire in the parlor. The storm lasted 2 days, leaving behind deep snowdrifts and a crystalline landscape that glittered in the sun when it finally emerged. The temperature dropped further, turning the world into a beautiful but dangerous frozen realm. On Christmas Eve morning, Yates woke before dawn to check on the cattle. He dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Daniela or Timothy. The house was warm from the banked fire, and he hated to leave its comfort for the biting cold outside, but the animals needed tending, storm or no storm. He was halfway to the barn when he heard the sound horses approaching, multiple riders by the sound of it. Visitors were rare in the best weather. In these conditions, they were almost unheard of. Instinct told him this wasn't a social call. Yates turned back toward the house, intending to retrieve his rifle, but he was too late. 3 riders emerged from the trees at the edge of the property, guns already drawn. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, he could make out enough of their features to recognize the family resemblance to Hank Doyle, the rustler he'd killed months ago. "Parker," the lead rider called. "Remember me, name's Frank Doyle, you killed my brother." Yates stood his ground, though he knew he was at a disadvantage, unarmed and exposed in the open yard. "Your brother was stealing my cattle. He drew on me first." "That's not how we heard it," Frank replied, dismounting and walking toward Yates, his gun aimed steadily. The other 2 men remained on horseback, flanking him. "Way we heard it, you shot him in the back while he was leaving." "Whoever told you that was lying," Yates said evenly. "Sheriff Miller knows the truth." Frank spat into the snow. "Sheriff's word don't mean nothing to us. We make our own justice." "What do you want?" Yates asked, though he already knew the answer. "An eye for an eye, Parker, a brother for a brother, but first we're going to take what Hank came for your cattle and anything else of value you got." Yates tensed, thinking of Daniela and Timothy asleep in the house. If he could keep the Doyle brothers focused on him, maybe they wouldn't think to search the buildings. "The cattle are in the north pasture," he lied. "Most were actually in the sheltered area behind the barn. Take them and go." "No need for more bloodshed," Frank laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet morning. Oh, there's need. You took something of mine, now I'm going to take something of yours. Before Yates could respond, the door of the house opened and Daniela stepped out onto the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Yates, I heard voices, she stopped abruptly, taking in the scene before her. Get back inside, Yates shouted, but it was too late. Frank had seen her and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, didn't know you had a woman, Parker. Changes things a bit. Daniela stood frozen on the porch, her eyes wide with fear but her chin raised in defiance. Who are these men, Yates? Just go back inside, please, Yates said, trying to keep his voice calm. Take Timothy and lock the door, but Frank was already moving toward the house, his gun now aimed at Daniela. Don't move, lady, and don't even think about getting a gun. He looked back at Yates. This just got interesting. Maybe I won't kill you right away after all. Maybe I'll let you watch while we have some fun with your woman first. Rage surged through Yates, overwhelming his caution. He lunged at Frank, catching him by surprise and knocking the gun from his hand. They fell to the ground, struggling in the snow. Yates landed a solid punch to Frank's jaw, but the outlaw was younger and stronger and quickly gained the upper hand. From the corner of his eye, Yates saw Daniela dash back into the house. Good, he thought. She could get his rifle, maybe hold them off until help arrived. Though who would help them out here, miles from town in a snowstorm, he couldn't say. Frank's fist connected with Yates' temple, sending a burst of pain through his head. Before he could recover, the outlaw had retrieved his gun and was standing over him, the barrel pressed against Yates' forehead. That was stupid, Frank spat, blood from a split lip staining his teeth red. Now I'm definitely killing you first. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Frank's gun. The outlaw staggered, a look of surprise on his face, then crumpled to the ground beside Yates. Blood bloomed across the back of his coat. Yates rolled away, looking toward the source of the shot. Daniela stood on the porch, his rifle in her hands, her face pale but determined. The two remaining outlaws, momentarily stunned by their leader's fall, recovered quickly and raised their weapons. Get down, Yates shouted, diving for Frank's fallen gun as bullets splintered the wood of the porch where Daniela had been standing a moment before. She had ducked back inside, but now the outlaws were firing at the house, where Timothy was still inside. Yates fired Frank's gun at the nearest rider, hitting him in the shoulder and knocking him from his horse. The third outlaw turned his attention from the house to Yates, but before he could fire, another shot came from the direction of the house. This one missed, but it distracted the outlaw long enough for Yates to take careful aim and fire again. The man fell from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The second outlaw, wounded but still dangerous, was struggling to his feet, reaching for his fallen weapon. Yates approached cautiously, gun aimed. Don't, he warned. The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. Don't shoot, I give up. Yates kept the gun trained on him while checking Frank Doyle for signs of life. There were none. Daniela's shot had been true, striking him directly in the heart. Yates, Daniela's voice, high with fear, came from the porch. She had emerged again, the rifle still in her hands but now hanging limply at her side. Is it over? It's over, he confirmed. This one's surrendering, the others are dead. She nodded, her face ashen. Timothy's still asleep, thank God. I closed his door before I came out. Yates turned his attention back to the surviving outlaw. What's your name? Bill Doyle, the man muttered, clutching his wounded shoulder. They were my brothers. Well, Bill, you've got a choice. You can bleed to death out here, or you can come inside where we'll patch you up before taking you to the sheriff in Belmont. Bill glared at him but nodded. Inside. Yates marched him toward the house at gunpoint. As they passed Daniela on the porch, Bill spat at her feet. You killed Frank. I won't forget that, lady. He was going to kill my fiancé and probably us too, Daniela replied, her voice steadier than Yates would have expected. I did what I had to do. Inside, Yates bound Bill's hands before allowing Daniela to treat his shoulder wound. It was painful but not life-threatening. The bullet had passed through cleanly. While she worked, Yates checked on Timothy, relieved to find him still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the violence that had occurred just outside. When he returned to the main room, Daniela had finished bandaging Bill's shoulder and was washing blood from her hands, her movements mechanical, her face expressionless. "I need to go into town, get the sheriff," Yates said. "Can you watch him until I return?" She nodded, picking up the rifle again. "We'll be fine." Yates hesitated, concerned about leaving her alone with the outlaw, but they had no choice. Someone had to alert the authorities, and he couldn't send Daniela out into the snow for the long ride to town. Keep the rifle on him. "Don't hesitate to use it if he tries anything." "I won't," she assured him, her voice still unnaturally calm. The ride to Belmont was arduous, the trail obscured by snow, the cold biting through Yates' coat. But he pushed on, driven by the need to return to Daniela and Timothy as quickly as possible. Sheriff Miller was shocked by the news but responded immediately, gathering a deputy and a wagon to transport the bodies and the prisoner. The return journey was even slower with the wagon, and it was nearly nightfall by the time they reached the ranch. They found Daniela sitting at the table, the rifle across her lap, her eyes never leaving Bill Doyle, who remained bound to a chair. Timothy was playing quietly in his room, still unaware of the morning's events. While the sheriff and his deputy dealt with Bill and the bodies of his brothers, Yates took Daniela outside for some privacy. The moment they were alone, her composure crumbled. She began to shake, tears streaming down her face. "I killed a man," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I took a human life." Yates pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "You saved my life and Timothy's. You did what you had to do." "I know," she sobbed against his chest. "But I still feel I never thought I was capable of." "SHH," he soothed, stroking her hair. "It's over now. You were braver than anyone had a right to expect. I'm so sorry you had to do that." They stood together in the snow as darkness fell, holding each other, neither willing to let go. Eventually, her tears subsided and she drew back to look up at him. "I meant what I told that man. You're my fiancé and I would do anything to protect you and Timothy. I love you both too much to lose you." Yates kissed her forehead, then her lips, a gentle affirmation of life and love in the face of death. "We love you too, more than I can say." When the sheriff and his deputy were ready to leave with their prisoner and the bodies, Yates saw them off with mixed emotions: relief that the threat was over, gratitude for their assistance, and lingering anger at the violence that had been brought to his doorstep. "Parker," Sheriff Miller said before mounting his horse, "you've got yourself a remarkable woman there. Not many would have had the courage to do what she did." "I know," Yates agreed, glancing back at the house where Daniela was now sitting with Timothy, reading him a story as if it were any ordinary evening. "Believe me, I know." That night, after Timothy was asleep, Yates and Daniela sat by the fire, neither speaking much but drawing comfort from each other's presence. The events of the morning had shaken them both, but had also crystallized something important: their commitment to each other, their determination to build a life together despite the dangers and difficulties of their world. "I was thinking," Yates said finally, breaking the silence, "maybe we shouldn't wait until Christmas for the wedding. After today, life is too uncertain, too precious to waste a single day." Daniela leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "What did you have in mind tomorrow?" "We could ride into town, find the minister, have a simple ceremony, just us and Timothy." She considered this. "What about our Christmas plans? The guests we invited? We could still have a celebration, a reception of sorts, but I want you to be my wife now, not days from now." Daniela smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the morning. "I like that idea, very much." The next day dawned clear and cold, the snow glistening in the sun. They bundled Timothy up warmly and set out for Belmont, the boy excited by the unexpected trip and the news that today was to be the wedding day. The ceremony was simple and brief, held in the small church with only the minister, his wife, and Timothy as witnesses. Daniela wore her blue dress as planned and Yates his Sunday suit. They spoke their vows clearly, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Timothy clapped his hands in delight. "Can I call you Mama now?" he asked Daniela as she knelt to hug him. Yates felt his throat tighten with emotion. They had discussed this, but hearing his son ask the question so directly made it suddenly, powerfully real. Daniela looked up at Yates, seeking his approval, though they both knew what his answer would be. He nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. "Yes, Timothy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You can call me Mama if you'd like." "Mama," the boy said, trying out the word. Then again, more confidently, "Mama." He threw his arms around her neck, hugging her fiercely. Yates felt the tears come then, streaming down his face unchecked. It had been so long since he'd heard that word spoken by his son. For 2 years, there had been only Pa, a title he cherished, but that also reminded him daily of what Timothy had lost, of the gap in their lives that he could never fill alone. Now, watching his son embrace his new wife, hearing him call her Mama with such joy and certainty, Yates felt a weight lift from his heart. Caroline would always be Timothy's mother by birth, but Daniela was giving him something he desperately needed: a mother's love in the present, not just in memory. Daniela was crying too, holding Timothy close as if she would never let him go. She looked up at Yates, her face radiant despite the tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for this gift." He knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around them both, his family now complete in a way he had never dared to hope for again. "Thank you," he replied, "for coming into our lives, for loving us, for being brave enough to stay." They returned to the ranch that afternoon, a family now in name as well as in heart. The Christmas celebration 2 days later was small but joyful, with a few friends from town joining them to offer congratulations and share in their happiness. Timothy proudly introduced Daniela as "my mama" to everyone who came, and each time he did, Yates felt his heart swell with gratitude and love. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. The ranch prospered under their combined care, and their happiness grew deeper roots with each passing day. Daniela's cabin was converted into a schoolhouse where she began teaching not only Timothy, but also the children from neighboring ranches who previously had no access to education. In the fall, as the aspens turned gold against the blue Nevada sky, Daniela shared the news they had been hoping for. She was expecting a child, due in the spring. Timothy was ecstatic at the prospect of becoming a big brother, and Yates found himself experiencing a joy he had thought lost to him forever. When their daughter was born the following April, a healthy, strong-lunged girl they named Caroline Elizabeth Parker, Yates held her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. This time, there had been no complications. Daniela had come through the birth tired but well, and their daughter was perfect in every way. "She has your eyes," Daniela said as they gazed down at the infant together. "And your spirit, I think," Yates replied, watching as the tiny girl gripped his finger with surprising strength. "She's going to be as determined as her mother." Timothy, now 6 years old and reading at a level far beyond his years, was a devoted big brother from the first moment. He insisted on helping with the baby, bringing diapers, singing to her when she cried, and telling her stories from his growing collection of books. "I'm teaching her to read already, Mama," he informed Daniela seriously one day. "She likes it when I show her the pictures." Daniela exchanged an amused glance with Yates over the children's heads. "I'm sure she does, sweetheart. You're a wonderful teacher, just like your father is a wonderful rancher." Life settled into new rhythms around the baby midnight feedings, afternoon naps, the constant wonder of watching a new person discover the world. Yates found himself remembering Timothy's early days, but this time without the shadow of grief that had colored those memories for so long. One evening, as summer approached again, they sat on the porch as they had so many times before, but now with Caroline sleeping in Daniela's arms and Timothy reading aloud from a book of Western tales. The wildflowers Caroline Sr. had planted were blooming along the path, tended now by both Daniela and Timothy, who had inherited his mother's love of growing things. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Yates looked at his family and felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. From the depths of grief and loneliness, He had found his way to this moment of perfect happiness, a beautiful, intelligent wife who matched him in every way that mattered. A son thriving under their combined love and guidance. A daughter who represented hope and new beginnings. "What are you thinking?" Daniela asked softly, noticing his contemplative expression. "That I'm the luckiest man in Nevada," he replied honestly. "Maybe in the whole country," she smiled, shifting the baby to lean against him. "We're all lucky, I think. To have found each other, to have built this life together." Timothy looked up from his book. "Pa, can we go fishing tomorrow? I want to show Mama my secret spot." "Of course," Yates agreed. "It's about time we introduced your sister to the joys of sitting quietly by the stream, don't you think?" "She's too little to fish," Timothy pointed out practically. "But she can watch, and Mama can help me with my casting. She's getting better at it." Daniela laughed. High praise indeed from the master fisherman. They sat together as darkness fell, the stars emerging one by one above them, the sounds of the night crickets, distant coyotes, the soft breathing of the baby creating a symphony of contentment. Yates put his arm around his wife, his son leaned against his other side, and his daughter slept peacefully between them. This was what he had fought for, what they had all fought for, a family bound by love, a home filled with learning and laughter, a future bright with possibility. The path had not been easy or straightforward, but it had led them here, to this moment of perfect belonging. And in the quiet of the Nevada night, surrounded by the family he had thought lost to him forever, Yates Parker knew with absolute certainty that he was home. Years passed, and the Parker Ranch grew and prospered. Daniela's school expanded, eventually moving to a proper schoolhouse built by the community on land Yates donated at the edge of their property. Timothy, with his mother's love of learning and his father's practical nature, excelled in his studies and began to take on more responsibility around the ranch as he entered his teenage years. Caroline, called Callie by her family, grew into a spirited, curious child with her namesake's golden hair and Daniela's green eyes. At 5 years old, she was already showing signs of exceptional intelligence, soaking up knowledge from both her parents and her adored big brother. 2 more children joined the family: James, born 3 years after Callie, and Michael, the youngest, who arrived 2 years later. The house expanded along with the family, with Yates adding rooms and a larger kitchen to accommodate their growing needs. On a warm summer evening in 1889, as they celebrated Timothy's 15th birthday with a picnic under the cottonwood trees, Yates found himself marveling at how far they had come. The scrawny, solemn 4-year-old who had watched his father bury a rustler was now a tall, confident young man with his mother's intelligence and his father's strength, equally at home with books and cattle. Daniela, at 37, was more beautiful to Yates than the day they met. The years had added character to her face, subtle lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of laughter and experience. Her hair still gleamed auburn in the sun, though she sometimes complained about finding silver strands among the copper. "What are you staring at, husband?" she asked, catching his eye across the picnic blanket where she was cutting birthday cake for the younger children. "The most beautiful woman in Nevada," he replied, making her blush even after all these years. Timothy rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "Pa's getting romantic again, Mama." "Better watch out. I like when Pa gets romantic," Callie declared, chocolate frosting smeared around her mouth. "He brings Mama flowers and they kiss." "Exactly right, Princess," Yates agreed, reaching over to wipe her face with a napkin. "A man should always be romantic with his wife." "Even when she's old?" 7-year-old James asked seriously. Daniela laughed. "I'm not that old yet, James Parker, especially when she's old," Yates said firmly. "The longer you're married, the more romantic you should be. Remember that, boys, and you too, Timothy, for when your time comes." Timothy blushed slightly and ducked his head. Yates suspected his son already had his eye on someone, Mary Henderson, the storekeeper's daughter, who attended Daniela's school and always seemed to find reasons to talk to Timothy when the family went to town. As the evening wound down and the younger children grew sleepy, Timothy pulled Yates aside. "Pa, can I talk to you about something? "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" The boy, young man now, Yates reminded himself, hesitated. "I've been thinking about my future. About what I want to do when I finish school." Yates nodded encouragingly. "And what have you decided?" "I want to go to college, in California maybe, or even back east." Timothy rushed on before Yates could respond. "I know the ranch needs me, but I want to study engineering. Learn how to build things better than they've been built before. I could come back after, use what I've learned to improve the ranch, maybe help the whole county with better water systems or bridges." Yates felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in his son's ambition, sadness at the thought of him leaving, and a deep satisfaction that Timothy felt free to choose his own path. "I think that's a fine idea," he said finally. "Your mother and I have always wanted you to find your own way in the world. If engineering is your calling, then you should pursue it." Timothy's expression was a mixture of relief and surprise. "You're not disappointed? About the ranch, I mean." Yates put his hands on his son's shoulders, looking directly into eyes that were so like Caroline's. "The ranch will always be here. Your brothers might choose to take it on, or you might decide to return to it after your studies, but your life is your own, Timothy. Your mother and I just want you to be happy wherever that leads you." Timothy hugged him then, something he hadn't done spontaneously in years. "Thank you, Pa. I was worried you'd be upset." "Never," Yates assured him. "Have you told your mother yet?" Timothy shook his head. "I wanted to talk to you first. She'll be thrilled. You know how she feels about education." They rejoined the family, Timothy looking lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. As they packed up the remains of the picnic, Yates watched his wife organizing their children with her usual efficiency, giving instructions, answering questions, resolving a minor dispute between James and Michael with a few well-chosen words. She caught his eye again and smiled, a private smile that still had the power to quicken his pulse after all these years. Later, when the children were asleep, he would tell her about Timothy's plans, and they would discuss what it meant for their family's future. But for now, he simply enjoyed the sight of her in the golden evening light, surrounded by the family they had built together. That night, as they lay in bed talking softly to avoid waking the children in the adjacent rooms, Daniela listened to Timothy's college plans with shining eyes. "We always knew he was destined for more than ranch life," she said, her head resting on Yates' chest. "He has such a curious mind, always wanting to understand how things work, how to make them better." "Like his mother," Yates observed, stroking her hair. She smiled against his skin. "And his father's practical nature, it's a good combination. We'll miss him terribly," Yates admitted. "The house will be quieter without him." "With 3 other children, I doubt that very much," Daniela laughed softly. "But yes, it won't be the same. He's our firstborn, our special boy." Yates was quiet for a moment, thinking back to that day 11 years ago when Timothy had first called Daniela Mama. How he had cried, overwhelmed by the simple word that meant so much. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Leaving Boston, coming west, taking on a ready-made family instead of starting fresh somewhere else." Daniela propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "What brought this on? Just thinking about choices, paths not taken. Timothy's decision has me reflecting, I suppose." She shook her head, her expression serious. "I have never regretted it, not for a single day. Coming here, meeting you and Timothy, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me a family when I thought I had lost mine forever. You gave me purpose, love, children of my own." She touched his face gently. "You gave me a home, Yates, in every sense of the word." He pulled her close, overcome with gratitude for this remarkable woman who had chosen to share her life with him, who had helped him rebuild from the ashes of grief, who had given his son a mother's love when he needed it most. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "More than I could ever say." "I know," she replied simply. "I love you too, always." As they drifted towards sleep, Yates thought about the journey that had brought them to this point, from that first meeting at the hotel in Belmont, through danger and grief and joy, to this moment of quiet contentment in each other's arms. It hadn't always been easy, but it had always been worth it. And as the years continued to pass, as Timothy went off to college and returned with an engineering degree and a wife of his own, as Callie grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's intelligence and independence, as James and Michael found their own paths in life. Yates and Daniela remained the center of the family they had created together. The ranch prospered and expanded under their combined guidance. Daniela's school became renowned throughout the territory for the quality of its education. They watched their children grow, welcomed grandchildren, and faced the challenges of aging together with the same determination and love that had sustained them from the beginning. And on quiet evenings, they still sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, his hand in hers, grateful for each day they had been given together and for all the days still to come. In their twilight years, as a new century dawned bringing automobiles and telephones and other modern marvels to even remote Nevada, they would look back on that snowy morning in December 1878 when they had stood before a minister and promised to love each other for the rest of their lives. They had kept that promise through good times and bad, through joy and sorrow, through all the ordinary days that made up a lifetime together. And neither had ever regretted a moment of it. For in finding each other, Yates Parker and Daniela Owens had found home not just a place, but a state of being, a belonging that transcended time and circumstance, a love that had healed old wounds and created something new and beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. And that, they both agreed, was the greatest blessing of all.